The morning Etta Doyle discovered the folded paper tucked beneath the loose floorboard in her father's study. The air in Caldwell, Kansas smelled of coming rain, and something she could not yet name. A reckoning, perhaps, or the quiet undoing of everything she thought she understood about the man who had, without a word, saved her family's life. It was the spring of 1879, and the town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning too far over a well, never quite sure whether he was looking for water or a reason to fall. Cattle drives rolled through regular as the seasons, kicking up red dust and leaving behind coin, trouble, and sometimes both in equal measure. The Doyle homestead sat 2 miles east of town, a modest spread of wheat fields and a small cattle pen, with a house that had once been proud and white, but had faded to the color of old teeth under years of Kansas sun and wind. Etta was 23 years old. She had her mother's dark auburn hair and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had learned early that in a place like Caldwell, a woman with opinions and no husband was regarded with the particular suspicion that people reserve for weather they cannot predict. She did not mind the suspicion. She had grown used to it the way one grows used to a splinter, aware of it always, but no longer crying about it. Her father, Thomas Doyle, was 51, and had been drinking himself gently but steadily into the ground since Etta's mother had passed a fever 4 years prior. He was not a mean drunk, which Etta supposed she should be grateful for. He was a quiet drunk, which was in many ways worse, because it meant he had conversations inside himself that never found their way out, and debts that piled up like unread letters on a table. She had known money was tight. She had known it the way she knew the roof leaked near the east window, something that needed attention, something she kept meaning to tend to, something that always got pushed to the back of the line behind the more immediate demands of surviving each day. She churned butter and sold it in town. She took in mending. She kept a kitchen garden that she tended with the grim devotion of someone who understood that a row of failed beans was not merely an inconvenience but a genuine threat. But she had not known about Harlan Cutter. Harlan Cutter was the man who held the note on the Doyle property, every acre of it, the house, the cattle pen, the wheat fields, the small barn, and the creek that ran along the southern edge of the land. He had bought the debt from the bank in Wichita when Thomas Doyle had stopped making payments, and he had done so with the particular enthusiasm of a man who had wanted that land for a long time and had finally found a clean legal mechanism to take it. She had not known that the debt had totaled $240, a sum that might as well have been the moon. She had not known that Harlan Cutter had given her father 30 days to pay it or vacate. And she most certainly had not known about Patrick Brenner. But before she found the paper, before she understood what Patrick had done, and at what cost, the story of how Etta Doyle and Patrick Brenner came to occupy the same narrow strip of Kansas earth began the way so many stories of that time and place began, with a horse, a man with nothing but his hands and his word, and a stretch of open road that led somewhere neither of them had planned to go. Patrick Brenner had arrived in Caldwell in late February of that year, riding a chestnut mare named Callie who was, by Patrick's own private accounting, the single finest thing he had ever owned, and possibly the finest thing he ever would. He was 27, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were scarred from fence work and rope burns, and one memorable incident involving a runaway wagon wheel outside of Dodge City that he did not like to discuss. His hair was dark brown, and he wore it longer than was fashionable, which nobody in Caldwell was inclined to remark upon because Patrick Brenner had the kind of quiet intensity about him that made people choose their comments carefully. He was not a gunfighter. He was not a gambler. He was not an outlaw, though he had in younger years ridden with men who leaned in that direction, and he had learned from that experience that the romantic notion of the outlaw life bore absolutely no resemblance to the cold and hungry and frightened reality of it. What he was a working cowboy, a man who understood cattle and horses and land the way some men understand music, in his bones, without having to think too hard about the mechanics. He had come to Caldwell because he had heard that the Hanford cattle outfit was hiring for the spring drive north, and he intended to sign on, earn a season's wages, and then perhaps do something sensible with the money. He had not yet decided what sensible looked like. At 27, he was running a little short on specific plans but very long on the particular restlessness that the Kansas plains seemed to breed in a man. He took a room at the Caldwell boarding house operated by a widow named Mrs. Elspeth Crane, who charged 75 cents a night and included breakfast, which Patrick considered a reasonable arrangement. He had been in Caldwell exactly 3 days when he first saw Etta Doyle, and those 3 days had been entirely ordinary, which made what happened next feel all the more like something that had been arranged by forces that did not consult him in advance. She came into the general store on a Thursday morning, carrying a basket over one arm, wearing a dress the color of a winter sky, and a set expression that told the world she had a list, and intended to work through it efficiently and without distraction. Patrick had been standing at the counter trying to negotiate the price of a new lariat with Henry Marsh, who ran the store with the cheerful conviction that everything he stocked was worth more than the customer believed. Patrick noticed her the way you notice a lamp being lit in a dark room, not because you were looking for it, but because once the light was there, everything else arranged itself around it. She moved through the store with purpose, picking up a sack of flour, examining a bolt of blue gingham with careful fingers, setting it back down. She had a small notebook in which she wrote things, consulting it with the seriousness of someone who could not afford mistakes. He did not speak to her that day. He watched her conduct her business, pay with coins she counted twice, and leave. He told himself this was all unremarkable and went back to arguing about the lariat. But he asked Mrs. Crane about her that evening at supper, casual as he could manage, and Mrs. Crane, who had the encyclopedic social knowledge common to boarding house proprietors everywhere, told him that was Etta Doyle, Thomas Doyle's girl, that she kept the family farm running more or less by herself, that she was not married and nobody expected her to be any time soon because she had a tongue like a schoolteacher and standards higher than a man of modest means could meet, and that she brought Mrs. Crane excellent butter every 2 weeks, which was, in Mrs. Crane's opinion, the true measure of a person's character. Patrick thanked her for this information and went to bed thinking about a woman he had no business thinking about. He signed on with the Hanford outfit the following Monday and spent the next 2 weeks working the cattle pens south of town, helping sort and brand the longhorns that would make the drive north to the railhead. It was hard, filthy, satisfying work, and it kept his body occupied even when his mind kept drifting back to dark auburn hair and a small notebook. He saw Etta again on a Friday afternoon when he rode into town to post a letter to his sister in St. Louis. She was coming out of the post office as he was going in, and they nearly collided on the 3 wooden steps that served as the entrance, and for a moment they were very close together in the way that circumstances sometimes arrange before you have a chance to think about it. She looked up at him with brown eyes that were slightly annoyed at the near collision and then slightly curious, and she said, "Pardon me," with a directness that suggested she was used to being the one to manage such situations. "No, that's my fault," Patrick said, stepping back and taking his hat off. "Patrick Brenner, I'm working for Hanford Outfit." "I know who you are," she said, and then seemed to catch herself being slightly rude about it because she added, "Mrs. Crane mentioned you, Etta Doyle." "I know who you are too," he said, and she looked at him with the particular expression of a woman recalibrating whether this was flattery or just information, and apparently decided it was the latter because she said, "Well, Mr. Brenner, the post office gets considerably less efficient if we both stand here blocking the door." He laughed, which surprised her. Most men she spoke to plainly either got defensive or got sycophantic. Patrick Brenner just laughed, settled his hat back on his head, and said, "Fair point. Good afternoon, Miss Doyle." She watched him go in, and then she stood on the board sidewalk for a moment longer than she intended to before she walked on. That was how it started. Over the following weeks, Caldwell being the size it was and Patrick's work bringing him into town regularly, they encountered each other with a frequency that began to feel less like coincidence and more like inevitability. They talked about nothing important, the weather coming in from the north, whether Henry Marsh's flour had been properly stored, the general reliability of the Hanford outfit's horses. Small things, safe things. But there was underneath all of it a current that both of them felt and neither of them remarked upon directly, the way you don't remark upon a river running beneath your feet even when you can hear it. In March, Etta's wagon wheel cracked on the road back from town, and Patrick, who happened to be riding in the same direction, helped her get it off and managed a temporary fix that would hold until she could get it to the blacksmith. He worked quietly and efficiently, and she handed him tools when he asked for them without making it a conversation about how much she appreciated his assistance, which he found refreshing. Most women he knew in similar circumstances felt compelled to narrate their gratitude. Etta Doyle just handed him the wrench and watched him work with the calm assessment of someone who was deciding whether he was competent. When it was done and she was loading back into the wagon, she said, "I have butter at the house. Would you take some for the trouble?" "I don't need butter," he said. "Everybody needs butter," she said flatly. He laughed again and she almost smiled and he took the butter. He ate it over 3 days and thought about her the whole time, which he recognized as a disproportionate response to dairy. The first time they had a real conversation was in April, when a late cold snap caught her garden, and she was out in the early morning covering her seedlings with cloth before the frost could finish them, and he was riding past on his way back from a night watch on the herd. He saw her and pulled up, and then for some reason he got down from Callie and helped her cover the rows, working from the far end while she worked from the near, and they met somewhere in the middle with the frost still silver on the grass around them. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "How's your father?" It was a sudden question and she looked at him sharply, but his face was just open and asking, no particular agenda in it, and so she said, "Not well. He doesn't sleep properly. He worries, but he doesn't say what about. He's been drinking more than usual, which is saying something." Patrick nodded. He had heard things in the saloon men talked around him easily because he mostly kept quiet, and quietness made people comfortable enough to forget you were there. He had heard Harlan Cutter's name in connection with the Doyle property, and the number $240 mentioned with the particular reverence people reserve for sums they know someone cannot pay. He did not tell her this. Not yet. Not when he was not entirely sure what he would do about it, if anything. He had no claim on her situation, and she had not asked him for anything. But he thought about it all the way back to the Hanford camp, and he thought about it that night when he was supposed to be sleeping, and he thought about it the following morning when he went to the hitching post where Callie stood and put his hand on her warm neck, and she turned her large dark eye toward him with the patient intelligence of a horse who had been with him long enough to know when something was troubling him. Callie was worth $250, possibly more. She was a cutting horse of the first order, trained by Patrick over 3 years, responsive to knee pressure alone, able to work cattle all day without tiring. The Hanford outfit had offered to buy her 3 times, and 3 times Patrick had declined, because Callie was not just a horse. She was his livelihood and his mobility and the specific form of independence that meant everything to a man with no property and no family in the territory. He stood there in the morning light with his hand on her neck, and he did the arithmetic, and he looked at what the arithmetic said, and then he put it away and went to work, because he was a practical man who did not make impulsive decisions. He made the impulsive decision 4 days later. It was a Monday, which Patrick would always remember because Mondays always had a quality of inevitability to them, as if the week was simply stating what it intended to do and daring you to argue. He had been in the saloon the previous evening and had overheard Harlan Cutter himself, drinking with his foreman at a corner table, saying that Thomas Doyle had 2 weeks left and there wasn't a soul in Caldwell who could put that money together in time. and that he was already planning how to run his fencing. Patrick had gone back to his room and sat on the edge of the bed with his boots on for a long time, not sleeping, not quite thinking, just sitting with the weight of a decision that hadn't finished being made yet. In the morning, he went to see a man named Abel Griggs, who dealt in horses out of a small operation on the south end of town and was known to pay fair prices for quality animals. Patrick brought Callie on a lead rope and stood outside Abel's fence while Abel walked around the mare with the practiced detachment of a man who makes his living not showing enthusiasm. "Fine animal," Abel said. "Cutting horse." "The best I've ever worked with," Patrick said, and he said it evenly because the alternative was not saying it at all. "What are you asking?" "250. Abel made a face. "That's high." "She's worth more than that," Patrick said. "You know it and I know it. You'll resell her for 300 to the first cattleman who looks at her work. I'm asking 250 and I'm asking you to pay it today in cash, and I'm asking you not to make me explain myself." Abel looked at him for a long moment and then looked at Callie and said, 240. Patrick felt the number land in his chest like a stone dropped in still water. He said, "Done." He walked away from Abel Griggs's yard with $240 in his coat pocket and without Callie, and the absence of her was physical, a space in the air where she should have been, and he kept his jaw tight and his eyes forward and did not look back. He went directly to Harlan Cutter's office, which was a building on Main Street that Cutter used for his various land dealings, and he knocked on the door and went in when the voice inside told him to. Harlan Cutter was a man of 45 who had the face of someone who had spent his whole life being slightly more comfortable than the people around him and knew it. He was not precisely villainous in the theatrical sense. He did not sneer or twirl a mustache. He was merely the particular kind of man who had learned that the legal mechanisms of property and debt were excellent tools for acquiring what other men's labor had built, and he applied this lesson with the bland cheerfulness of someone who considers himself simply practical. He looked up at Patrick with mild curiosity. "Help you. You hold the note on the Doyle property," Patrick said. $240. Cutter leaned back in his chair. "What business is that of yours?" "I'm making it my business," Patrick said. "I have the money. I want to buy the note." There was a silence. Cutter looked at him with a reassessment happening behind his eyes. This was a cowboy, a working man. Where did he come by $240? But money was money, and Cutter was, above all, a man who operated within legal and financial realities. "Why?" Cutter asked. "I don't see that it matters," Patrick said. Cutter was quiet for another moment. Then he reached into his desk drawer and produced the promissory note, a folded paper of the type that passed for serious legal documentation in the frontier territories, signed by Thomas Doyle and witnessed, and stamped with the seal of the Wichita Bank from which Cutter had originally bought the debt. He laid it on the desk. "You understand," Cutter said, "that buying the debt doesn't make you the owner of the property. It makes you the man Thomas Doyle owes, which is a different situation." "I understand that," Patrick said. "And you understand that if Doyle can't pay you either, you'd be the one who could foreclose." "I understand that," Patrick said again. Cutter looked at him a moment longer and then he pushed the note across the desk and said, "Cash on the table, then." Patrick counted out the money, every dollar of it, the whole 240, the price of Callie and nothing more, and he took the note and he put it in his inside coat pocket, and he walked out into the Kansas afternoon, which was blue and enormous and entirely indifferent to what he had just done. He had 1 hour before he was expected back at the Hanford camp. He went to the general store and bought a small envelope from Henry Marsh, wrote Thomas Doyle's name on the outside in his careful handwriting, and inside he put the note and a separate piece of paper on which he had written, in the most straightforward language he could manage, "Mr. Doyle, this debt is discharged. No payment is required or expected. The note is yours to destroy. P. Brenner." He meant to deliver it quietly to the house, to slip it under the door or hand it to Thomas Doyle directly and not make a scene about it. He did not want Etta to know. He did not want her to feel obligated or suspicious, or to look at him with the particular expression a woman gets when she believes a man is trying to purchase something that isn't for sale. He had not done this to earn anything. He had done it because when he had stood in the early April morning covering her frost-threatened seedlings, and she had looked at him with those careful brown eyes, he had understood without being able to fully articulate it even to himself, that some people were worth more protection than they were willing to ask for. He had not done it to be her hero. He had done it because it was right, and because he had the means to do it once in his life, and because he was not certain he could live with himself if he kept his horse and watched Harlan Cutter walk away with her family's land. He rode to the Doyle farm that afternoon, tied his borrowed mount at the fence. He had borrowed a horse from the Hanford string, a temporary arrangement, and knocked at the front door. Thomas Doyle answered. He was a tall man, thinner than he should have been, with faded blue eyes that still had remnants of the intelligence they had once held more visibly, before 4 years of whiskey and grief had softened their edges. He looked at Patrick with the blank wariness of a man who was expecting trouble. "Mr. Doyle," Patrick said, "my name is Patrick Brenner. I work for the Hanford outfit. I have something for you." He held out the envelope. Thomas took it. He turned it over in his hands. "What is this?" "It's the note," Patrick said. "Your property note. I bought the debt from Cutter this morning. The paper inside says the debt is clear. You don't owe me anything and you don't owe Cutter anything. The farm is yours free and clear." Thomas Doyle stared at him. The color in his face changed, went from its usual gray pallor to something red around the eyes, and Patrick could see the man's throat working with swallowing whatever was trying to come up. "Why?" Thomas said. It was not exactly a question. It was more like a word he was testing the weight of. "Because I could," Patrick said. "That's all. There's no catch to it. I don't want anything in return. You don't owe me anything, and I'm not going to be back here asking for it." Thomas Doyle looked at the envelope for a long moment and then looked up at Patrick with the eyes of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. "I don't know what to say to you," Thomas said. "You don't have to say anything," Patrick said. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Doyle." He nodded, went back down the steps, and rode away before either of them said anything more, because Patrick Brenner had never in his life been comfortable with gratitude, and he was not about to start. The thing he had not counted on was that Thomas Doyle, relieved of the crushing weight of his debt and the imminent terror of his daughter discovering how badly he had failed the family, went to the saloon that same evening to celebrate in the only way he knew how. And Thomas, being a man who was emotional when he drank and now had a specific extraordinary thing to be emotional about, told 2 men at the bar about what the young cowboy from the Hanford outfit had done. One of those men was Etta's nearest neighbor, a farmer named Jack Hollies, who mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it when Etta came by 2 days later to return a borrowed pot. Etta came home from the Hollies farm and went directly to her father's study. She did not ask him first. She had learned that asking her father direct questions often produced elaborate sidesteps, and she did not have the patience for it this particular afternoon. She went to the study, which smelled of old pipe tobacco and a sadness she had grown so accustomed to that she barely registered it anymore, and she looked at the desk and the bookshelves and the windowsill, and she found nothing. She was about to leave when she noticed the loose floorboard. It had always been loose, had been loose since before her mother died, and her father used the space beneath it for things he considered important. Legal papers mostly. The deed to the property before he had put that in the bank. A small amount of money he kept for emergencies. She knelt and pried it up, and there was the envelope opened, the note inside along with the second paper in a stranger's handwriting. She sat on the floor of her father's study, with the afternoon light coming through the window at a long angle, and she read both papers twice. The number $240 looked back at her from the promissory note. The words "the debt is discharged" in a careful, plain handwriting looked back at her from the other paper. P. Brenner. She sat there for a long time. There was anger first, which surprised her slightly. Not at Patrick, not exactly, but at the whole situation, at her father for letting it come to this without telling her, at the faceless machinery of debt and property law that could make everything her family had built into numbers on a piece of paper that a man like Harlan Cutter could simply buy. She was angry at the years of her mother's butter churning, and her own mending, and the carefully counted coins, all of which had never quite been enough. And then the anger settled, the way anger does when it has run its course, and underneath it was something else. Something quieter and more persistent. Patrick Brenner had traded his horse. She did not know exactly which horse. She had seen him on different animals in recent weeks, borrowed horses from the Hanford string, and she had not thought to ask why, but she had seen him on the chestnut mare early in the season, and she had not seen that mare in some time now, and she was beginning to understand why. He had traded his last horse to buy her father's debt, and then discharged that debt without asking for anything, and he had not told her. He had done this enormous, quiet, costly thing and ridden away and gone back to work as though nothing had changed. She folded the papers carefully and put them back in the envelope and replaced the floorboard and went to find her father. Thomas was in the kitchen, which was an improvement from the sitting room, and he was attempting to make coffee, which was a further improvement. He turned when he heard her come in, and he had the look of a man who knows exactly what has been discovered. "Etta," he said. "How long?" she said. "How long had it been that bad?" he told her. "It came out in pieces, the way things do when they have been kept back for a long time, the original loans when the wheat crop failed, the bank in Wichita, the way Harlan Cutter had moved in when the bank had been willing to sell the debt for less than face value, the 30 days' notice, his utter despair and inability to see any way forward. He told it all in the voice of a man who is not seeking forgiveness, but is simply finally, after a very long time, telling the truth. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "Did you ask him to do it, Patrick Brenner?" "No," Thomas said. "He just came to the door. He just showed up with the money and handed me that envelope. I didn't ask him. I didn't even know he knew about it." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I need to go into town." "Etta," her father said, "don't make something difficult out of something good." "I'm not making anything difficult," she said. "I'm going to say thank you." She found Patrick at the Hanford camp, which was south of town, and she rode there on her old bay horse with her spine straight and her hands steady on the reins, which was mostly a performance of steadiness rather than actual steadiness. She asked one of the other cowboys where Patrick Brenner was, and the man pointed toward the north end of the cattle pen, where Patrick was working on a section of fence that needed restringing. She dismounted and walked toward him, and he heard her coming and turned, and when he saw her face, the set of it, the way she was looking at him with those brown eyes that were doing several things at once, he set down his fencing tools with the careful deliberation of a man who is preparing himself for something. "Miss Doyle," he said. "You bought my father's debt," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him deciding how to handle this. She could see him wanting to deflect it, to say something that would minimize it, to reduce the enormous thing he had done to something small and manageable that neither of them would have to stand in the presence of very long. "Yes," he said, "and let it be just that." "You traded your horse for it," she said. "I sold my horse," he said. "That's a little different." "Is it?" He was quiet. She took a breath. "That horse was everything you owned. Everybody knows that about a working cowboy's horse. That horse was your livelihood and your independence and your—" She stopped. "You didn't even know me." "I knew you enough," he said, and the simplicity of it, the plainness of it, hit her somewhere in the chest with a force she had not anticipated. She looked at him for a long time, out there in the afternoon sun with the cattle moving behind him and the Kansas sky enormous above everything. She looked at the way he was standing, not proud about it, not braced for her gratitude, just standing there with his hands at his sides, looking back at her with dark eyes that were steady and a little anxious and entirely without pretense. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because I didn't do it for anything in return," he said. "Not for gratitude and not for—" He stopped. I just didn't want you to feel like you owed me something." "I don't," she said. I want to say thank you, Patrick Brenner, and I want you to hear it because what you did was the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever done for my family, and you don't get to shrug it off just because you're not comfortable with gratitude." Something in his face shifted, not much, just a slight softening around the eyes. He said, "All right, you're welcome." "That's better," she said. And then, because she had come this far and might as well go the rest of the way, she said, "Come to supper on Sunday. My father wants to thank you himself, and I make a decent pot roast." He said he would come. He came on Sunday, and he came the Sunday after that, and then he started coming on Wednesday evenings too, which nobody officially arranged, but which happened anyway with the same inevitability as rain after a long dry spell. He brought a bottle of apple cider the first time, which Etta noted. He helped Thomas with a fence repair the second time, which Thomas noted. He and Etta talked after supper on the porch, while Thomas sat inside with his pipe, the old man giving them the particular privacy of proximity, present enough to be decent, but absent enough to let whatever was happening between them happen at its own pace. They talked about everything. She asked him about where he had come from Missouri originally, then west with an uncle who had ranched in Texas, then 3 years of cattle driving, then the gradual drift north to Kansas. He asked her about her life here, about her mother, about the farm, about what she wanted for herself beyond the immediate demands of keeping things going. "I want the farm to be what it was," she said one evening in the blue dusk of a May night, "when my mother was alive and my father was himself. I want the wheat fields to be good again. I want to not count every coin twice." "That's achievable," he said. "You say that like it's simple." "I say it like it's true," he said. "The land is good. Debt is cleared. With a full season and proper work, I don't have the hands for it," she said. "It's just me and my father is—" She stopped. "Your father is getting better," Patrick said carefully. She looked at him. "Is he?" "I think he might be," Patrick said. "I think having the weight off his shoulders, I think a man can only carry so much before it changes him, and when the weight is gone, sometimes the man comes back." She was quiet for a while, looking out at the dark fields. "He's been talking about going back to the wheat," she said. "He mentioned it this week. He hasn't mentioned it in 2 years. "There you are," Patrick said. She turned to look at him in the dim light and said, "You're an optimist." "I'm a pragmatist," he said. "There's a difference." "Not in the dark, there isn't," she said, and then she smiled, which she did not do often enough and which Patrick was coming to understand was one of the specific good things in the world that he had not known he was waiting for. In June, the Hanford Drive returned from its run north, and Patrick collected his wages, $68 for the season, which he put in the bank in Caldwell. He was offered a place on the fall drive, and he said he would think about it, which was the first time he had not simply said yes to the next piece of work, and he recognized this change in himself without fully examining its source, though its source was increasingly obvious. He asked Etta to ride with him one Saturday morning, when there was nothing particular requiring her attention, and they rode out to the eastern edge of the Doyle property, where the creek ran through cottonwood trees that were full and green with summer. They tied the horses and walked along the water, and Patrick talked about the land, what it would take to run a full wheat operation, how many acres could be turned, what sort of equipment would help most. "You've been thinking about it," she said. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said, and she let that sit there between them without pressing it. But that afternoon, returning to the house, she put her hand briefly on his arm and said, "Patrick, you should know that She stopped and then tried again. "What you did for us. It isn't just that I'm grateful. It's that I understand now what kind of man you are, and that matters more than I expected it to." He stopped walking. He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face, which was doing the very difficult thing of being completely honest, and he said, "Etta." "Yes," she said, as if he had asked a question, though he had not formed one yet. "I would like very much," he said, choosing his words with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been composing them for weeks, "to stay here, not for the Hanford outfit, not passing through, here, if that means something to you." She looked at him for a long moment. The cottonwood trees moved in the summer wind, and the creek ran its quiet course, and the horses stood placidly at the bank, and everything in the world seemed to pause the way it does at the moment of a decision. "It means something to me," she said. He took her hand, which had been on his arm, and held it. That was all in that moment. Just her hand in his, and the river, and the tremendous ordinary fact of two people choosing the same direction. But things were rarely simple, even when they were also good. In mid-July, Harlan Cutter came to the farm. He came on a Tuesday morning when Patrick was not there. Patrick was in town at the hardware store working out the pricing on some equipment, and Thomas Doyle was out in the far field, and Etta was alone in the kitchen. She heard the horse and came to the door and found Cutter standing on the steps with his hat in his hands, which did not make him look humble so much as careful. "Miss Doyle," he said, "I wonder if I could have a word." She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway. He told her that he had been speaking with his lawyer, and that he believed the sale of the promissory note to Patrick Brenner might not have been entirely regular, that there was a question about whether the original bank had the authority to transfer the debt without proper notification of all parties, and that he intended to look into whether the transaction could be undone. Etta listened to all of this with the stillness of a person who is deciding exactly how angry to be and whether to let it show. "What you mean," she said, "is that you lost the property and you have found a legal theory that you would like to use to get it back." "I mean that there may be irregularities," Cutter said. "There are no irregularities," she said. "The sale was legal. The debt was discharged. You took money for it and it is done. And if you have any other business here, Mr. Cutter, you are welcome to speak to my attorney in Wichita." She did not have an attorney in Wichita, but the specificity of it sounded serious, and Cutter looked uncertain. "This isn't over," he said, which was exactly the kind of thing people say when it is, in fact, over and they know it. "Good day," Etta said, and closed the door. She went to town that afternoon and told Patrick what had happened, not because she needed him to fix it. She did not. But because he was the one she talked to now, the one she told things to, and not telling him would have felt wrong. They sat in the dim interior of the post office's back room, which the postmaster, an elderly man named Clarence who was conveniently nearly deaf, rented out on the hour for private meetings, and Patrick listened to the whole account with a stillness that was the very particular stillness of a man working to keep his anger at a manageable temperature. "He can't undo it," Patrick said. "The transaction was legal. I have a copy of the signed note and the payment receipt. Cutter signed them himself." "I know," Etta said. "I can speak with a lawyer if you want to formalize it further," he said. "There's a man in Wichita, Elias Crawford, who's known for this kind of work." "I told Cutter I already had one," she said. Patrick looked at her. "You don't." "I know that," she said. He almost laughed. He controlled it. "All right," he said. "Let me write to Crawford. It'll cost some money, but not much, and it'll put the thing to bed for good." He wrote to Crawford, and Crawford wrote back 3 weeks later with a clear and legally well-supported letter confirming that the transfer had been valid in all respects, and that any further challenge from Harlan Cutter would require him to demonstrate standing that he did not have, which Crawford politely suggested he lacked. The letter was sent to Cutter's office as well as the Doyle farm, and they heard nothing further from Harlan Cutter after that. The farm began to breathe again. Thomas Doyle, as Patrick had predicted, was emerging from the long fog of his grief and guilt with the tentative determination of a man who has been given a reason to be present again. He was not entirely reformed. He still drank more than he should have on Friday evenings, and there were still mornings when the weight of the world was visible in the set of his shoulders. But he was in the fields again. He was talking about the wheat and the fall planting and what it would take to get the equipment in proper order. Patrick was there for more of it than not. He had told the Hanford outfit that he would not be joining the fall drive, and he had said it clearly and without apology, and the foreman had looked at him with the knowing look of a man who has seen other cowboys say goodbye to the driving life and could identify the specific reason. Patrick had stayed in Caldwell, continued to board at Mrs. Crane's, and had begun working the Doyle property 3 and 4 days a week, helping Thomas with the farming preparations. He charged them nothing for this, which Thomas objected to, and Etta allowed herself not to think about too strenuously because the practical reality was that they needed the help. Late August in Kansas was the color of baked honey and late light, and it stretched the days out long and golden. And in those long evenings, Patrick and Etta found more time together, walking the property in the cool of 7 o'clock, sitting on the porch with the last of the light going pink and purple over the western fields, talking, and not talking in equal and comfortable measure. He had kissed her for the first time at the beginning of August, near the old cottonwood tree by the creek, not with the sweeping drama of the novels she sometimes read, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has been moving in this direction for long enough to know it is right. She had kissed him back with the same certainty, and there had been a moment after when they stood with their foreheads together in the evening shade, and neither of them said anything because what was there to say that would have been more than the moment already was? "I'm not good at saying things like this," he told her, and she said, "I know," and he said, "I mean things like things that have to do with," and she put her hand on his face, which was warm from the summer sun, and said, "I know what you mean, Patrick," and that was enough. In September, he bought a horse. He bought her at the auction in Caldwell, a gray mare, 3 years old, sound as a bell, for $65. He named her no particular name, but Etta, watching him work her in the round pen behind the Doyle barn, said, "She looks like she ought to be called something with dignity." And Patrick had looked at the gray mare with her quiet eyes and said, "What do you think of Silver?" And Etta had said that was fine, practical, dignified enough, and the horse had apparently agreed because she responded to it by the second day. October brought the fall planting, which Patrick and Thomas did together with a single furrow plow that Patrick had repaired using parts from the hardware store, and a considerable amount of ingenuity and effort. Etta made lunches and carried them to the field, which she told herself was simply efficient, and which was also something her mother had done, and which felt, in the doing of it, like a continuity she had not expected to feel again. Thomas noticed. Thomas was quieter than he used to be and sometimes moved through the world at a slight remove, but he noticed, and one evening in early October he sat down next to Etta at the kitchen table after Patrick had gone home and said, "He's a good man." "I know," Etta said. "Your mother would have liked him," Thomas said. Etta did not trust herself to speak for a moment. Then she said she would have fed him constantly. Thomas laughed, a real laugh, from somewhere unguarded, and the sound of it was so unexpected and welcome that Etta had to look away and occupy herself with the lamp until she had her face in order. On the 1st of November, 1879, Patrick Brenner asked Thomas Doyle for his daughter's hand, which he did in the kitchen on a Thursday morning while Etta was in town with the butter, and Thomas said yes before Patrick had finished the sentence, and then shook his hand with the grip of a man who is grateful beyond the reach of his vocabulary. Patrick waited for the right moment to ask Etta, which turned out to be that same evening on the porch, in the cold early dark of autumn, with the stars enormous above the Kansas plain. He had thought carefully about what to say and had prepared something somewhat elegant, and what actually came out was, "Etta, I would like for you to be my wife if you're willing to have me," which was not elegant but was so precisely, unmistakably him that she laughed, which was not the response he had prepared for. "I'm sorry," she said, "not sorry at all. Yes, Patrick, yes, I am absolutely willing." He pulled her toward him and she rested her cheek against his chest, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the cold dark, while the stars wheeled above Kansas, and neither of them felt inclined to go inside. They were married in December, in Caldwell's small Methodist church, on a day when the sky was a low pale gray, and the ground was iron-hard with the first real cold of winter. Etta wore a dress of blue wool that Mrs. Crane had helped her make, and Patrick wore the best clothes he owned, which were not elaborate but were clean and well-fitted, and he stood straight in them. Thomas walked Etta down the aisle with a steadiness that he had been practicing, and his eyes were bright and clear, and he did not falter. The minister was a round-faced man named Reverend Holt, who had married a considerable number of Caldwell's residents and conducted the ceremony with the warmth of someone who genuinely believed in what he was doing. The church held perhaps 30 people, neighbors, hands from the Hanford outfit who had come to see Patrick through, Mrs. Crane and the other boarding house regulars, Jack Hollies and his wife who had inadvertently started the whole chain of events by telling Mrs. Hollies about Thomas Doyle's debt. When Reverend Holt said the words that made them husband and wife, Patrick took Etta's face in both his hands with an extraordinary gentleness and kissed her, and someone in the back of the church. It was very possibly Mrs. Crane made a sound that was trying to be a clearing of the throat, and was instead a great deal more emotional. After the ceremony, at the small reception in the church hall, Etta found herself standing with a cup of cider in hand, watching Patrick talk with her father, and Thomas was laughing at something Patrick had said, and the sight of her father laughing made her chest ache with something she could only call gratitude, though it was larger and more complicated than the word usually held. Mrs. Hollies appeared at her elbow and said, "You know, it was my husband who told me, and I told you, and I hope you don't mind that we meddled." Her face was anxious. "I don't mind at all," Etta said. "I am very grateful that you did." They moved into the Doyle house together, which was the logical choice. The house had room. The farm was Thomas's livelihood, and Patrick was already half running the property. Thomas moved into the smaller bedroom and gave them the large one, which he did with a combination of practicality and a shy awkwardness that Etta found unbearably endearing. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard, not spectacular, not dramatic, just relentlessly cold and gray, and requiring constant work to keep the animals fed and the house warm. Patrick was good at winter. He had a capacity for the specific patient labor of cold months, keeping the water from freezing, tending to the horses, cutting wood, that Etta recognized as the same quality she had always brought to her own necessary work, and she found that working alongside him in the practical tasks of surviving a Kansas winter was, unexpectedly, one of the things she loved best about being married to him. They argued sometimes. She had opinions and he had opinions, and they were not always the same opinions, and she had lived alone long enough that she was accustomed to things being done her way, and he had lived alone long enough that he was accustomed to making decisions without consultation. They felt their way toward each other's habits and preferences with the particular concentration of two people who like each other too much to let disagreements calcify. The first real argument was about the spring planting plan. Patrick thought they should expand the wheat acreage, and she thought they should diversify into a small cattle operation, because one failed wheat crop had already nearly destroyed them, and it was dangerous to depend on a single thing. He said the land wasn't set up for significant cattle. She said the land could be adapted. They went back and forth on this with increasing heat for 2 evenings, and resolved it by deciding to increase the wheat modestly and also acquire 6 head of cattle, which was enough to begin a small operation without overextending on either front. This compromise satisfied neither of them entirely and both of them sufficiently, which Patrick said was the definition of a good agreement. She laughed and he said, "You're laughing at me again." "I laugh at you because you say things that sound like you read them in a book," she said. "What book tells you the definition of a good agreement?" "My uncle," he said. He wasn't a great rancher, but he could talk about ranching with tremendous authority. Spring came to Kansas in 1880 with a generosity that felt almost apologetic after the long winter. The wheat went in, and the 6 head of cattle arrived, bought from a man named Pemberton south of town who was reducing his herd, and Thomas was out in the fields every morning with a focus that Etta had not seen in him since before her mother's death. Patrick was learning the rhythms of farming. He was a cattle man by training, but he was a quick study, and Thomas had more knowledge than he had been able to apply for years. And the two of them together, the older man with the knowledge and the younger with the energy, made a partnership that worked. One morning in April, Etta woke before dawn and lay in the dark listening to the house settle around her, and she understood, with a clarity that was entirely new and a little startling, that she was happy. Not content, not managing, not surviving. Happy, in the specific and ample way that requires all the parts of a life to be in reasonable alignment. The farm was theirs and it was working. Her father was himself again. She was lying next to a man who had, without asking anything in return, made all of this possible, and who had turned out to be, in the daily practice of a shared life, everything she might have hoped for, and some things she had not known to hope for. She thought about the folded paper under the floorboard, which was still there. She had looked at it a few times since that first afternoon, had held it the way you hold something that marks a before and after. 12 words in a plain handwriting. The debt is discharged, no payment is required or expected. She thought about Callie, the chestnut mare who was presumably now somewhere in the Caldwell area, given that Abel Griggs rarely sold to buyers from far away. She had asked Patrick once in the early months whether he missed her. Every day, he had said without artifice or self-pity. She was a fine horse. Can we find her? Etta had asked. Abel will have sold her on, he said. She was worth too much to keep. Etta had gone to see Abel Griggs the following week, without telling Patrick, and had asked about the chestnut mare. Abel, who was a fundamentally decent man beneath his professional dispassion, had looked slightly uncomfortable and said that yes, he had sold her on, to a cattleman from down near the Texas border who drove through in the spring. She was gone, properly gone, and Etta had walked home with that knowledge and filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that were sad and true and had to be accepted. But in June of 1880, something unexpected happened. Patrick came home from town one afternoon with a horse on a lead rope that was not silver. It was a chestnut mare. It was not Callie. Etta could see that immediately this horse was slightly smaller, a different shade, the white marking on her forehead in a different shape. But she was close enough to make the heart pause, and when Patrick walked her into the yard, his face had a complicated expression that was trying very hard not to be too much of anything. Her name is River, he said. She came off a drive from Texas. She needed a home. Etta looked at the horse and then at her husband and said, "Did she cost much?" $40, he said, "which we can afford." "We can afford it," she confirmed. "I just thought she's a cutting horse. She'll work the cattle, she earns her keep." He was explaining himself carefully, which he only did when something had more significance to him than he wanted to demonstrate directly. Etta went to the horse and put her hand on the mare's nose, which was warm and soft and interested. "Hello, River," she said, and then to Patrick, "She's beautiful." He stood there with his hand on the lead rope, and she looked at him and understood everything, that he was not saying that this was not Callie and he was not trying to pretend it was, but that it was something, that it was the first step back toward having something of his own again, something that was not borrowed, and that it felt significant. "Come here," she said. He came and she put her arms around him right there in the yard, which they were both past being self-conscious about, and she said into his shoulder, "She's perfect." And he held her and they stood with the new horse in the June sunshine and the wheat fields behind them and the whole long warm summer ahead. Thomas Doyle had been drinking less since the spring began. Not perfectly, not completely. He was still a man who had a complicated relationship with whiskey, and that did not vanish simply because circumstances improved. But less. Visibly, measurably less. He was sleeping better and he had regained some of the weight he had lost, and on Sunday mornings when they all ate breakfast together, he told stories about the old days on the farm when Etta was small, stories she had not heard in years, and she listened to them with both hands around her coffee cup and felt her mother's presence in the kitchen as something warm rather than something missing. In August, Etta discovered she was pregnant. She told Patrick on a Sunday evening in the garden where they had taken to sitting after supper in the long late light, and she said it simply and directly, the way she said most things, and he looked at her with an expression that went through several things very quickly before arriving at something that was not quite composure but was in the same neighborhood. How are you?" he asked. "I'm well," she said. "I feel well. She stopped and then said honestly, "I'm frightened and I'm glad." He reached across and took her hand. "I am too," he said, "both of those." Thomas was told the following morning and sat down abruptly in the kitchen chair, put his face in his hands, and stayed there for a moment while Etta and Patrick looked at each other over his head. Then he lifted his face, which was wet at the eyes, and said to his daughter, "Your mother would have been so happy." "I know," Etta said, and her voice was steady, though only just. "She would have been insufferable about it. She would have knitted 16 things and given everyone advice about everything." Thomas laughed, wet-eyed, and Etta went to her father and put her hand on his shoulder, and the three of them were quiet for a moment in the kitchen in the warm August morning, and the wheat fields outside the window were gold and full and nearly ready for harvest. The harvest came in late August, strong and clean, the best the Doyle farm had produced in 5 years. Patrick and Thomas brought it in over 4 days with the help of Jack Hollies and 2 young men from town who were hired for the season, and when it was done and the grain was in the barn and the numbers were tallied, it was enough, more than enough. It was the first year in a long time that enough was a word they could use without qualification. Patrick stood in the doorway of the barn in the last light of harvest day, looking out at the cleared fields, and Etta came to stand beside him and slipped her hand through his arm. "This is what it was supposed to be," she said. "Yes," he said. "I keep thinking about the paper," she said. "The one under the floorboard." He looked at her. "I should have burned it by now," she said. "It doesn't matter anymore. It's been paid for and settled and done, but I keep going back and reading it." "Why?" She thought about how to say it. "Because it's the thing that started it," she said. "That note. That Harlan Cutter's name on one side and your name on the other, your 12 words." She paused. "It doesn't seem like enough paper for everything that came from it." He turned to look at her in the barn doorway, the last of the day's light going warm orange on her face, and he said, "Burn it if you want. It's over and done, and the only thing it proves now is what I'd already decided by the time I walked into Cutter's office." "What was that?" she asked. "That you were worth more than a horse," he said. "That your family was worth more than my independence. That some things are more valuable than what you can keep." She looked at him for a long time. Out in the field, a meadowlark was finishing its last song of the evening, and the wind moved through the cut wheat stubble with a dry, golden sound, and the entire world was evening-colored and at rest. "I love you, Patrick," she said, which she said to him regularly now but which still had the quality of the first time, still held the specific weight of words that had been arrived at through honesty rather than habit. "I love you," he said, and his voice was unguarded in the way it only was with her. The careful steadiness he showed the world dropped in this place, in this light, with this woman. "I have since before I had any right to." She went back to the house, and she took the envelope from beneath the floorboard, and she stood for a moment with it in her hands, the promissory note with its numbers and Cutter's signature and her father's signature at the bottom, and the small paper with the 12 plain words in Patrick's handwriting. She read them one more time. "The debt is discharged. No payment is required or expected." She burned them both in the kitchen stove, and watched the paper curl and go black and disappear into the fire, and felt the last of something settle and go quiet in her. The winter of 1880 was the winter their son was born. He came in late November, early and briefly alarming, but healthy and vigorous, and loud about his opinions from the first moment, which Etta considered a family trait. They named him Thomas James Brenner Thomas for the grandfather who sat in the kitchen for the first 3 nights of the baby's life, unable to stop checking on him, and James for Patrick's father, who had died when Patrick was 15, and whom Patrick rarely spoke about, but who was clearly present in the way. Patrick moved through the world with the particular self-reliance of someone who had learned young not to count on certain things being permanent. Thomas James Brenner, at 3 days old, had a grip that Patrick said would make him a fine roper someday, which Etta said was an extremely premature assessment, but which she did not actually disagree with. Mrs. Crane came to visit in December, bearing a knitted blanket of extraordinary yellow wool which she presented with the self-possession of someone who has been waiting a long time to deploy this particular skill, and she sat in the kitchen with Etta while Patrick and Thomas were in the barn, and she said, "I knew from the first week he was here. The way he asked about you. Casual as anything, but a man doesn't ask about a woman that carefully unless he's already decided something." "You might have mentioned it to him earlier," Etta said. "He was figuring it out in his own time," Mrs. Crane said firmly. "Men like Patrick Brenner can't be pushed. They decide for themselves or they don't decide at all. I just kept giving him good breakfasts and trusting the process." Etta looked at her. "You're taking credit." "I'm acknowledging my contribution," Mrs. Crane said with perfect dignity, and Etta laughed so hard the baby startled and looked up at her with enormous indignant eyes. The year turned to 1881, and the farm prospered. The cattle herd expanded to 12 head by spring, which was a manageable size and which Patrick managed with River, who had turned out to be everything a cutting horse needed to be, quick and intelligent and tireless. Thomas had a good year in the wheat fields and was drinking now only on Saturday evenings, a measured and deliberate amount, and had confessed to Etta one afternoon that he had been speaking with Reverend Holt on Tuesday mornings, which he told her with the slightly embarrassed air of a man confessing to something he is simultaneously proud of, and which Etta received with the warmth she had learned to offer her father without overwhelming him with it. In the spring, Jack Hollies mentioned to Patrick that there was a parcel of land adjoining the Doyle farm on the north side that its owner, an elderly man named Warren who was relocating to live with family in Missouri, was looking to sell at a fair price. It was 80 acres, well-watered, good soil, currently given over to scrub and cottonwood. Patrick came home and told Etta about it that evening after supper, and they sat at the kitchen table long after Thomas had gone to bed, with a lamp between them and the sleeping baby in the next room, and they talked about numbers and futures and what they wanted the Doyle Brenner farm to be in 10 years. "It's a lot of money," Etta said. They had $700 in the bank, which was more than they had ever had but which would leave them thin if they spent $350 of it. "It's a lot of land," Patrick said. "Good land. And land adjoining what you already have is worth more than land elsewhere because it's all one piece." She looked at him across the table. "You want it." "I think it's the right thing," he said carefully. "I think we can manage the debt on it with 2 good harvests. I think if we leave it, Cutter or someone like him buys it, and we spend the next 10 years dealing with a difficult neighbor." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you ever notice that your arguments always have 3 parts?" He looked at her, slightly wrong-footed by the change. "My arguments? You always do it in 3, she said. "I think this, I think that, I think this other thing. 3 parts, every time." "That is not relevant to the question of 80 acres, he said. "It is a little bit relevant," she said, "because the 3rd part is always the one that actually matters, and in this case it's the same as the first 2, which means you're not arguing, you're just saying yes from 3 different directions." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Are we buying the land?" "Yes," she said, "we're buying the land." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and the lamp threw warm light across both of their faces, and outside the Kansas night was full of stars and the specific silence of a farm at rest. They bought the land from old Warren in May of 1881 and spent the summer clearing the scrub from the most fertile sections, a project that Thomas approached with a determination that sometimes alarmed his daughter and delighted his son-in-law. Thomas Doyle had found, in his late middle age, the purpose that had eluded him through the worst years. The farm that he had nearly lost was now something he was actively building, and the distinction between maintaining and building turned out to be everything. Young Tom, as everyone called the baby to distinguish him from his grandfather, was a serious and observant child who watched everything from his mother's arms with dark eyes that were clearly Patrick's, and a set expression that was clearly Etta's. He began walking at 10 months, which everyone agreed was too early, and showed a disturbing willingness to get into trouble faster than his parents could prepare for it. And by his first birthday in November, he had strong opinions about horses, which he demonstrated by trying to walk directly toward every horse he saw regardless of size or temperament. Patrick, who spent a great deal of time with his son in the barn, recognized this with the subdued pride of a man who did not want to get ahead of himself. "He'll be a horseman," Thomas said one morning, watching the boy stand at the fence of River's pen, his small hands gripping the lower rail, staring at the gray mare with an expression of total focused intention. "He'll be whatever he decides to be," Etta said, in the tone of a woman who has already made her peace with the probability that he will be a horseman. In the fall of 1881, a letter arrived from Patrick's sister Catherine in St. Louis, the first communication in some months, and it contained the news that she was coming west to visit. She arrived in November on the stage from Wichita, a small, quick-moving woman of 25 with dark hair and Patrick's same dark eyes, and the particular energy of someone who had grown up urban and found the open space of the plains equal parts thrilling and disorienting. She stayed for 3 weeks and entirely disrupted the household in the most wonderful possible way, bringing St. Louis sweets for young Tom, an extraordinary quantity of opinions about everything, and a warmth toward Etta that was immediate and genuine and went a long way toward filling a specific gap in Etta's life: the absence of women her own age who knew her well. "He wrote to me about you," Catherine told Etta one afternoon when they were making bread together, Thomas having taken the baby out to the field. "From the very beginning," he said, "there's a woman here, Catherine, who manages her family's farm mostly alone and counts her coins twice and tells it straight." He said it like it was the greatest possible recommendation. Etta thought about Patrick at the boarding house in February, asking Mrs. Crane about her, reducing her to a set of observable facts: what she did, how she moved through the world. It was, she thought, exactly how Patrick would have seen it. Not her face or her hair, though presumably those had registered too, but what she did and how she did it. "He's lucky I wasn't terrifying," Etta said. "He would have found that interesting too," Catherine said. "He has always been attracted to things that require his full attention." Catherine went back to St. Louis in December with a standing invitation to return, which she did the following spring and the one after that. And in the spring after that, she married a man named Arthur Colby, who was a rancher operating west of Caldwell, which meant she stopped visiting from St. Louis and started simply living down the road, which was a much better arrangement all around. The farm grew. The additional 80 acres were broken in the second year and planted in a portion of wheat and a portion left for grazing. And by 1883, the Doyle-Brenner operation was one of the better-regarded small farms in the Caldwell area. Not large by the standards of the big cattle outfits, but consistent, well-managed, and solvent in a way that was increasingly notable given the pressures beginning to bear on small farming operations across Kansas. Those pressures were real, and Etta and Patrick talked about them honestly. The railroad companies expanding their influence over freight rates, the large cattle combined squeezing out small operators, the political questions around land and water rights that were beginning to sharpen in ways that would define the next decade of the territory. They were not naive about what they were up against. But they had a clear deed, a paid-down property, a growing operation, and two people who had both demonstrated the capacity to keep going when things were hard. Etta had a second pregnancy in 1883, which was easier than the first in some respects and harder in others, and their daughter arrived in the early spring of 1884, born as the Kansas sky was opening up with the first real rain of the season. They named her Margaret, for Patrick's mother, and she came into the world with a vigorous fury that the midwife said was always a good sign, and Etta said was clearly going to be a permanent characteristic. Young Tom, at 3 years old, was introduced to his sister with the cautious formality of someone who had been the only child for long enough to have opinions about it. He inspected her for a long moment and then announced that she was small, which was true, and then asked if she would grow, and Patrick said yes, considerably, and Tom appeared to accept this and went back to asking when they could go see the horses. Thomas Doyle held his granddaughter for the first time in the kitchen, in the yellow afternoon light, and rocked her with the practiced gentleness of a man who had done this once before, 30 years ago, and remembered exactly how, and his face was entirely open with something that had no name adequate to it. He had not had a drink in 4 months. He had not announced this, had not made a ceremony of it. He had simply stopped in the particular quiet way of a man who has made a decision in private and is content to let the results speak for themselves. Etta had noticed and had said nothing, which was her form of the deepest respect. He put the baby in her arms after a while and said, "She's going to be something." "They all are," Etta said. He looked at her with that clear, wash-clean gaze he had recovered and said, "I'm sorry, you know, for all of it. The debt and the years and everything I let go wrong." "I know," she said. "It shouldn't have been on you," he said. "You shouldn't have had to carry it." "It wasn't only on me," she said, "and it's done now." "It's been done for a long time." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "He's a good man. He was good before you loved him, which is the important part." "Yes," she said, "that's the important part." Patrick came in from the barn where he had been giving Tom his first genuine lesson in how to properly approach a horse. Not from behind, never from behind, and always let the animal know you are coming. He came in with Tom on his hip, and the boy's boots leaving fresh mud tracks across the kitchen floor that Etta observed and chose not to address immediately. And he looked at Etta in the chair with the baby and the lamp light warm around her. And he stopped in the doorway with an expression that he made no attempt to compose into anything other than what it was. Thomas saw it and picked up his coffee and said to no one in particular, "I'll just check on the fire in the sitting room," and left them to it. Patrick sat on the low stool near Etta's chair, Tom sliding down from his hip and going immediately to press his face against the edge of the blanket his sister was wrapped in, and Patrick looked at Etta with the full weight of everything they had built together, and she looked back at him the same way. "4 years ago," he said quietly, "I was sleeping at a boarding house and I didn't know what I was doing in Kansas." "And now," she said. "And now," he said, and did not finish the sentence because there was nothing he could add to it that the room didn't already contain. She reached out her free hand and he took it, and young Tom wedged himself between his father's knee and his mother's chair, and looked at his sleeping sister with an expression of increasing acceptance. And the spring rain tapped softly against the windows of the Doyle farm, which was the Brenner farm now too, which was theirs. In the years that followed, the Brenner farm continued to take root and grow the way things do when they are tended by people who understand the long game. Not dramatically, not with sudden spectacular returns, but with the steady accumulation of work and knowledge in good seasons and managed bad ones. They expanded the cattle operation to 30 head by 1886, which required Patrick to be in the saddle more, and which River bore with the professional tolerance of a horse that had found her purpose. Tom, at 6, could already help bring the cattle in from the near pasture, which Patrick supervised with scrupulous attention to safety, and which the boy accepted with the serious focus he brought to everything he cared about. Margaret, at 2 and then 3 and then 4, was a force of nature that occupied the household the way a spring flood occupies a creek bank completely, energetically, and with no particular interest in anyone's plans for containment. She was not reckless in the way that people sometimes mean by spirited. She was precise about her enthusiasms, which included horses, her grandfather's storytelling, and an apparently infinite capacity for questions. Thomas answered every question she asked him with a seriousness that he had once reserved for things he considered genuinely important, and Etta watched them together and thought that this was what redemption actually looked like. Not a single dramatic moment, but a grandfather on the porch with a little girl in his lap, telling her about the farm when it was young. Harlan Cutter left Caldwell in 1885, which the town received with the collective quiet relief of a community that has been walking carefully around an unpleasant fact for a long time. He sold his properties and moved north to Wichita, where presumably the mechanisms of land acquisition continued to interest him, and Caldwell's Main Street exhaled. Mrs. Crane sold the boarding house in 1886 to a man and wife from Ohio and retired to a small house 3 streets over. And Etta made sure she had butter every week, and Patrick made sure she had firewood through the winters. And Mrs. Crane maintained that this was entirely unnecessary, and received it all with the precise graciousness of someone who has been taking care of others for so long that being cared for is a language she is still learning to speak. In 1887, the wheat came in light due to a dry summer, and Patrick and Etta sat at the kitchen table with the ledger, and did the arithmetic and determined that they were going to be all right, not comfortable, but all right, which was the specific margin they had learned to recognize as sufficient and refuse to mistake for failure. The cattle carried them through the lean year, which justified Etta's original insistence on diversification, which Patrick acknowledged directly and without qualification, which she appreciated. Thomas was 60 in 1888, and they had a gathering for it that included half the neighbors within 5 miles, and Catherine and Arthur Colby from down the road, and Mrs. Crane and Reverend Holt, and the entirety of Tom and Margaret's increasing circle of farm neighboring children. And it was a good, loud, warm occasion, and Thomas sat at the center of it with his grandchildren climbing on him, and received the full evidence of his restored life with the dignity of a man who has earned it the hard way. That evening, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, Etta and Patrick sat on the porch in the dark as they had from the beginning, and the stars were out in that enormous Kansas way, and the farm was quiet around them. "Do you remember," she said, "the morning I came to the Hanford camp, what you said when I asked you why?" "Because I could," he said. "That's all I said." "That's all you said," she agreed. "I didn't believe it was all." "It wasn't," he said. "But it was enough to say at the time." She leaned against his shoulder, which was warm through the cotton of his shirt, and she thought about the folded paper that no longer existed, burned in the kitchen stove years ago, and about the $240 which had been the whole substance of a life and which had purchased through some alchemy of decency and timing, and the specific courage of a man who did not know her but knew enough, the whole shape of what they had now. "It was enough," she said. "Everything you said then and since. It was always exactly enough." He put his arm around her, and they sat in the dark with the farm breathing around them, the wheat fields and the cattle in the near pasture and the 2 horses in the barn, Silver, who was going gray now in the muzzle, and River, who was still all purpose and energy, and the house behind them full of sleeping children and a sleeping old man who was at peace, and the night air cool and clean, and carrying the faint good smell of earth and growing things. Nothing was unresolved. Nothing was left open or unanswered or unpaid. The debt on the paper had been discharged years ago, and the different and larger debt, the one that ran between 2 people who had given each other the full weight of their lives and their trust and their days, was not a debt at all, which was the part that Patrick had understood from the beginning, and which Etta had come to understand watching him, season by season, year by year, choose the same direction every morning. She thought of her mother sometimes, in the kitchen or the garden, or the particular angle of late afternoon light on the wheat fields. She thought of what it meant to build something in a place like this, in a time like this, where the whole machinery of land and law and frontier hardship was designed to grind small people down, and how the only answer to it was what she and Patrick and her father had done: hold on, keep working, find the people worth holding on for, and hold on together. She said none of this aloud. She did not have to. Patrick Brenner sat beside her on the porch of the farm that was theirs, in the late summer night of 1888, in Caldwell, Kansas, which sat at the edge of the world as they knew it, and he held her and watched the stars. And everything that needed to be said had been, and everything that needed to be done had been, and the story of a horse and a piece of paper and $240 had become, over 9 years of ordinary, extraordinary life. Something that neither of them could fully contain in words, which was, as any real love story must eventually admit, exactly the point. Young Tom found the letter the following spring. He was 8 now, interested in everything, given to investigating among some papers in the storage chest under the stairs. It was not the original note, which was ash. It was the letter from Elias Crawford, the lawyer from Wichita, the one that had confirmed the transaction's legality and ended Harlan Cutter's challenge. Tom brought it to his father with the gravity of a boy who senses a thing has weight without knowing its specific history. "What is this?" he asked, holding it out. Patrick took it and read it, and there was a moment where his face did the thing it sometimes did, a brief private thing, settled quickly. "It's a letter from a lawyer," Patrick said, "about this farm." About the farm. Tom was interested. He looked around at the farm, the fields visible through the open doorway, as if seeing it in a new light. "When I first came to Caldwell," Patrick said, sitting down on the bench by the door, settling Tom beside him, "there was a man who was trying to take this property from your grandfather. He had bought a piece of paper that said your grandfather owed him money, and if the money wasn't paid, he could take the land." Tom listened with the full, focused attention he brought to everything that mattered. "So what happened?" Tom asked. Patrick thought about how to tell this. He looked at his son's dark, serious eyes and said, "I sold my horse, my best horse, the one I'd trained myself, and I used the money to buy the piece of paper from that man, and then I told your grandfather the debt was clear." Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You sold your horse for the farm." "For the farm," Patrick said. "Before it was my farm, before I even knew if it would ever be my farm." "Why?" Patrick looked up and found Etta standing in the kitchen doorway, watching them, and she was watching him with that specific expression she had, the one that had been there in the spring morning when they covered the frost seedlings together, the one that had been there at the fence of the Hanford camp when she said thank you and meant about 10 things at once. "Because," Patrick said to his son, with the farm spreading out around them and the spring light coming in through every window, "sometimes you know something is right before you can explain all the reasons why. And when that happens, you trust it, and you do the thing, and you don't wait." Tom considered this with great seriousness. "Did you miss the horse?" he asked. "Every day," Patrick said, "for a while." "But you don't anymore." Patrick looked at Etta in the doorway and then back at his son and said, "No, I don't anymore." And that was true and complete and required nothing further. The Kansas morning came in through the windows, and the children were alive and whole and loud in the world. And the wheat would be planted before the end of the month. And Thomas would be out in the field by 7 with his boots, and his face turned toward the sun. And Etta Doyle Brenner would stand in her kitchen in the farmhouse that was fully and irrevocably and deeply theirs. And she would know, as she knew every morning, that the paper under the floorboard had been worth finding, and the horse had been worth the trading. And the quiet man who had done it without being asked, and without wanting payment, had turned out to be, in the precise and permanent way of things that are genuinely meant, home.